My name is Michael Likudis. I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture at Notre Dame. And I also chair the jury, which selects the laureate for the Richard H. Driehaus Prize. The Richard H. Driehaus Prize is given annually to a leading classical architect from the United States or another part of the world. It is $200,000, making it the largest prize in architecture in this country. And it is also accompanied by a small bronze miniature of the Grecic monument of Lysikrates in Athens. The Richard H. Driehaus Prize was established to commemorate the work of leading classical architects. Much of the architectural discussion today is about fads and trends and fleeting moments, and largely also about entertainment. Architecture's entertainment, I think, has become a big issue. And many people felt that there needed to be an award for an architect that conveyed a sense of the seriousness of architecture, that our cities are places in which we share our lives and we all search for the common good. Richard Driehaus wanted to have a greater impact in the built environment. He particularly wanted to see greater effects of classicism and tradition in that built environment. By classical, we don't necessarily mean just columns. It's about the enduring traditions of virtually every culture in the world. Classical simply means the highest form of that traditional architecture, the best, the exemplary. Abdel-Wahed El-Wakil was trained as a modernist in Egypt. And he was planning to come to the United States. And through a series of beautiful events, he was never able to make the voyage. Instead, he discovered what he was looking for in Egypt. Hassan Fathy was an amazingly wonderful architect who also dealt with the humble and the monumental, and taught Abdel-Wahed another way of looking at the world. And so at that point, our laureate achieved a kind of revelation about what was important to him, that meaning was tied to his own sense of roots and his own commitment to his place, that it couldn't be found by chasing an elusive dream around the world. Abdel-Wahed El-Wakil was selected this year's laureate for the Richard Driehaus Prize because of his commitment to monumental architecture and to humble architecture, for architecture of place and to architecture that belongs to the world. And all of these are not incompatible. They are mutually interdependent and necessary and complementary. And it's this universal man idea that he embodies that was so captivating. In fact, the work that he has done in Oxford with the Center for Islamic Studies is a testament to how different cultures come together to produce a new piece of work that speaks to all people. His work in developing a machine to make bricks out of dirt that helps architects and masons of a locality build things when there isn't anything to build from is a testament to his commitment to the architecture of humility. His mosque designs, all load-bearing masonry, are a testament to his love for his religion and to the timeless values that it represents.
Over the past 4 decades, Abdel-Wahed El-Wakil has built mosques, public buildings, and private residences throughout the Middle East that are both of our time and timeless. Here are some highlights from an interview with Abdel-Wahed El-Wakil conducted by the New Yorker architecture critic Paul Goldberger.
I should begin by saying that this award this year to Abdel-Wahed El-Wakil has a particular double meaning for the Driehaus Prize. First, of course, we're honoring, as the prize has in past years, a great body of work that proves the ongoing relevance and vitality of traditional architecture and urbanism in a contemporary world. But second, this year the prize expands its horizons beyond the Western tradition. That's the particular additional significance this time. It's a reminder that the issues that the Driehaus Prize addresses are not only ones relevant to Europe and America, but also all the way around the world in cultures that, if anything, may have even more at stake in this issue than we do here. And that the whole question of what role the past should play in enriching the present is an international one, and one that in a world of globalization is of even more relevance than it might have been before. Anyway, I'd like to begin our conversation by recalling something that you said yesterday when we talked for a little bit without a big audience about your education. And you said that you were trained as a modernist at the university in Egypt. You were first in your class and a passionate innovator, and that you realized only later on that you had learned nothing about Egyptian architecture, that you, I think you said, I knew more about Western architectural traditions than my own. How did you go from that to becoming such a powerful and articulate exponent and architect in a more traditional vocabulary?
Well, our curriculum at the University of Ain Shams in Egypt, all universities in Egypt, was based on I think the Beaux-Arts curriculum. So the first year we spent drawing all the year with Corinthian, Doric, and Ionic columns, and our test would be given a plan, and from the plan to build the three-dimensional Salle de Pas Perdu or Opera House or whatever.
Very relevant to the
And I was very good at it because we lived in one of the prominent examples of Renaissance houses that Fabio was talking about in Argentina. We had the same in Egypt. So I would always, we had a huge mansion next to the American Embassy in Garden City. And unfortunately, Garden City was designed to be, it's neither a garden nor a city now, unfortunately. It's a horror of high-rise, but they had beautiful Renaissance houses there. And so I grew up in those mansions, and I was very good at it. And then we started doing the modern. And I had access to the library at the university because there was a catch-22 situation with bureaucracy. Is that the library was open till 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and we could only go to the library after 2 o'clock because we had classes. So, bureaucrats, they're geniuses. They never sorted it out, so the librarian turned out to be a colleague of my father at school. So he used to go and take the books from the library, put them in his bag, then come in the afternoon, give them to me at home, and leave them for 2 weeks, then come take them back. So I was very fortunate to get all the books I want. So I was always avant-garde because we were trained to copy from magazines, all the fashions. Architecture was like, who's the most innovative? And then I was given a post to teach at the university. And then I said, what am I going to teach? I looked at all the projects that were going up around the Cairo suburbs.
And this was about what year? Maybe?
I graduated in 1965.
Okay.
So I was teaching, I met Hassan Fathy, coming to that story, how things changed.
So 1965 was
to
about
67, I was teaching.
What we might call a sort of a high point of the low point of modernism.
But also I was supposed to do my thesis. And also very interesting story. Egyptians are a bit of storytellers, so bear with me. So another thing is I was preparing to come to the United States. Now, I knew there was something wrong with the architecture. I wasn't happy with the university. And one German architect came to lecture one day and he said, why do you have all this ugly architecture when you have such a beautiful tradition? Look at the Islamic architecture and the Pharaonic, and you have this horrible German Bauhaus townhouses there. But he didn't say Bauhaus. He was talking about the parody of his architecture coming from Germany.
High-rise architecture.
No, 4 or 5 stories, you know, staircase going those modern slums of apartment townhouses. And I looked, I said, yes, how did this happen? And then I realized that this man was making criticism of our architecture. It was nothing but a parody, a cheap imitation of German architecture. And so I said, all right, how to go back at tradition? So I was very lost, really. And then finally, somebody told me, why don't you go and see Hassan Fathy? But before I went to Hassan Fathy, I was ready to leave Egypt. John Ritchie was helping me from Ford Foundation, professor here at Purdue, used to work with A.T. Kearney, Chicago. So my love affair with Chicago began then, and I got approved in Illinois, Champaign.
Oh, yes, yes.
And it was coming June, and I was very happy. I was preparing everything. And then one day I go into the living room in our house, and there's a beautiful girl sitting there, and my aunt tells me, oh, this is your sister's friend from university, Laila Shmau. Why don't you let her read your coffee cup? I said, oh my God, superstition and all this thing from my old aunt. What's this nonsense about coffee cup? And she said, no, she does, you know, read it. And she looked at my coffee cup and she said, oh, you're planning to travel, but you will not leave. So I went to my sister's room. She was preparing, getting ready to go out with her friend. So this is no joke. You know, my life depends on going to America. So I told her nothing. She said, how did she know I was leaving? She said, from the coffee cup. So I went, looked at the coffee cup, nothing but black spots from Turkish coffee. I said, where is America? It's not there. She said, no, but what you're seeking for in America, you'll find here in Egypt in 6 months. Anyhow, the summer comes, and damn it, we have the 67 war, 6-day war. And immediately, again, our relationships were severed with America. I couldn't travel. I went crazy. And I went to my father and said, this is your destiny, you can't do this. And later on, I met Hassan Fathy, 6 months later. And recently, I was looking at a French book of confessions by André Magre, I think. And he was saying in French, au-dessus de chaque chemin comme celui dans notre vie, il y a un autre chemin inaperçu qu'on le poursuit toujours sans le savoir. Translated, in every path we choose in our life, we follow. Maybe Leon can help me with the French better. There is another path above it, which we're always pursuing without ever knowing.
Yes.
And that whenever you try to resist that path, there is detainment in your life. And if you accept it, you know, like you submit to it, you submit to a greater force, to a greater destiny, you tend to lead to what your life is leading you to. So I met Hassan Fathy, and he, of course, was like, nobody mentioned him at university, so we didn't know him.
Yes. Right.
And he was like a treasure house. It's like finding, you know, a treasure house of knowledge. Men born 1900, from the old generation, and with a vast knowledge, a sort of overall knowledge about things, about architecture, about life, about philosophy, and I think I spent with him 5 years, day and night. They were the most beautiful years of my life. And it was not only about architecture. He said, why do you want to go to America? I said, there's no opportunity in this country. The country is, is going apart. And then he said, you should do something for your country. I told him, who's doing anything for the country? It's all a bunch of corrupt people. And I said, that's why you should be here. You should be doing, it's because there is so much corruption that you should be doing something. And it was amazing. It reminded me of A Man for All Seasons when he was going to be chopped.
Thomas More.
Thomas More, and his daughter's crying. She said, but father, the whole country is corrupt. Why don't you accept what the king said? And he said, it's because the whole country is corrupt. It gives me more reason to be here.
Yes.
So in a way, he was teaching me as a young man that you have to fight for your beliefs, and if you want, it is not how much you know in life, it's how much you dare to do in life. And this gave me a lot of courage. Really.
It sounds as if Hassan Fathy was for you not just an architectural model and teacher, but really almost a prophet in a way of your life.
Well, funny you said prophet, because when I wasn't going to say this, but I said, why do you want me to do all this? Why do you want me to, do something for the country? And, he sent me for 3 months to see all the villages and the poverty and I saw scenes that upset my stomach, really. I mean, I saw so much poverty, and, it's existing in India and in Egypt, and a lot of people who are outside the monetary system and this modernization system we're all bragging about, and we might end up all being poor soon, who knows. But I said, give me an example of someone who's doing this. Because I didn't see anybody in the country from my university, from the government, from anybody doing anything for the country. It was all people were grabbing. And he said, you have the example in front of you. And I said, where? You? He said, no. No, you have the Prophet Muhammad, you have Jesus, you have all those prophets that came and to change the world and do it. They are your examples. And for one moment, this was the beginning of being aware of living history.
Yes.
Because all these persons he was talking about was dead history. To a modern mind, it's finished. Tabula rasa, start the new again. And he was bringing back, so it was amazing because this is what at the end I started to make draw the line between the modernist and the traditionalist. And to start working on that, because everywhere I used to go, I used to have arguments. And also the modernist is against tradition, is also against God. And I was once asked to go to the Museum of Modern Art. I was in New York attending the ceremony for Hassan Fathy's memorial in St. John the Divine, and they had honored his memory. And at the same time, there was, at the Museum of Modern Art, there was an Aga Khan debate, and I was asked to be there in that debate. So in the green room, the
moderator?
The moderator of MoMA, he came and he said, I want the papers and to see what you're talking about, so I moderate the debate. And so Oleg Grabar gave him a paper, I'm talking about this period, I'm talking about this. And he came to me, he said, do you have any paper? I said, no. He said, what are you going to talk about? I said, I don't know. And I threw the gauntlet. I said, I'm just here to prove that everything they'll say is sheer nonsense. They were furious. So we started the debate, and immediately they started attacking. And of course, the public saw me as the underdog, so they started having, feelings for me. And they said, you talk about tradition. What kind of a car do you drive? So I told them, a two-humper car. I don't have any bumpers. He expected me to tell him I'm on a camel, so two-humper car. And then we started anyhow, but it was a day. I mean, the New Yorkers loved it because he came and he said to me, "You're all liars, you're all hypocrites. Look at Riyadh." He doesn't know I'm from Egypt. He thinks I'm in Saudi or something. And look at Riyadh. It's the ugliest hole on earth, and blah blah blah. And you are all hypocrites. What's the Islamic architecture? Why do you keep talking about it? What's the relationship between God and architecture? And I know I've been studying sacred art for a long time. I know that all art started, it was all about God.
Yes.
Everything that began in art was about God until some time the ego of some royal families ended up wanting to have their portraits on the walls. But before that, all the iconography, all the symbolism in art was about God. So I said, what are those guys from MIT and Harvard talking about? And how can you explain to public in the short time of 5 minutes what architecture has to do with God and what to explain to them about Islamic architecture? So I said, okay, I'll give them an Egyptian story. So I said, you know, I'm from Egypt. And guess who's from Egypt? Moses. So I know more about Moses than you do. Now what happened with Moses? He was furious when the Samiri, started making the Jews worship the cow, the golden calf. So he got so furious, and Moses was of a very hot temper, as the Quran tells us, and he smashed the tablets. So those poor Jews picked up the tablets, put them together, and hung them on the wall, and that was the first mosaic. It was the Mosaic law. So now today, you ignorant people who say that what is the relation to God, you go and tell your designer, interior designer, I want a mosaic at the entrance of my door in my bathroom, not realizing that the word mosaic comes from Mosaic law, from the first tablet that was smashed. And oh my God, the applause I got, they were so happy. And then I thought, I bet you know, I also had a degree from MIT for naval building. That's how we calculated the load of all the animals for the ark. And Solomon, how did he design the temple in the image of Jerusalem in heaven? You know something? All this was dictated to them by God, and you still ask me what's the relationship between God and architecture? Aren't they ridiculous? And that was it. So I phoned my friend later he was phoning me, told me, did they massacre you? I said, no, the public was going to massacre them.
That's wonderful. Yeah, your reference to Moses. And to the fact that we all have the broken 10 Commandments on our bathroom floor, reminds me actually of, or is a good segue into one of my favorite Hebrew phrases, which is tikkun olam, which means to heal the world.
Yeah.
And it seems to me as though one of the things you've been saying is that through Hassan Fathy, you began to think of architecture as a way of healing the world, as a way of remediating the injustices and improving the lives of people.
The architect is very important because he structures space.
Yes.
And there is two ways you have an internal world and an external world. In ancient Egypt, they had it beautiful. They had what they call the Ka and the Ba. Mm-hmm. And I only found this also from a priest psychologist who wrote Care of the Soul here when I was in America 10 years ago, a beautiful book relating the two aspects of human nature. And that he says, for example, what food is for the body, friends are for the soul. Mm-hmm. So in a way today we have no friendships, it's all business relationships. So he says the soul is starved. Mm-hmm. In traditional societies, they had friendship, they were They had cafes in the street. People had time to be together. And the same thing with this duality. When you're talking about architecture, you have an internal environment, which usually is expressed through dance. Your external environment is expressed through architecture. So in the arts, you have the extremes of the arts, where you have, for example, dance and architecture. For example, painting and music, whatever. So you have the audible and the visual and the... So architecture it creates all our activities. All the million of acts that happen in the city are in a way propped like a stage by architecture. So, and you experience space. The children learn, because when you go and you see in Italy the kids in the street playing with the ball, and the ball bounces on the wall and it hits back and it loses energy, and all this interaction. So in a way, our interaction with space is our education. It's very important, and that's where the role of the architect is important in that sense. In another sense, also I found out, is that architecture makes us understand our cosmos, our cosmology. So it's related to cosmology. So the dome is really a simulation of heaven.
Of heaven, yes.
Yeah. Why, if the Romans, if the Greek and the pharaohs didn't use domes and vaults for the temple, and they knew how to build with them practically for granaries and tombs and Oleg Raber also was supposed to be the expert on Islamic architecture. He says, why? I said, I don't know, you're the historian, you tell me. You're the one who says in your books, it started in Roman times when I was at school, you tell me. He said, you don't know. I said, no, I do know. He said, what? Tell me. I said, no, I won't tell you, make a book about it. He said, but I told him, I prove to you that I know. And he said, well, I said, why Japan, they knew about the wheel, they never used it for transportation. So you see, you're talking about architecture being influenced by material. That's not true. Architecture is influenced more by the cosmological view of a culture. And Japan, Shinto religion, I've been in Kyoto, the most beautiful place in the world. And they used to transport people without wheels, because they said if we make tracks, we're going to scar Mother Earth. So tracks never, you always change the tracks, so nature remains. And until today, go to Japan, any corner of a street or a balcony is beautifully landscaped. That's the influence of the religion. Yeah. So also in architecture, it's the same. It's not because somebody discovered, that you can span a hole without columns, that you should have a hole without columns.
Is there anything particular about Islamic space? Is there an Islamic view of space that one could define as different from that of either Western architecture or Asian?
One thing I found about Japanese architecture and Islamic architecture, and then later I found a book on Zen and Islam by a Japanese guy, which was a fascinating book. And the relationship of this simplicity that doesn't cost less than everything said, and the truth that exists in the architecture. No falsehood. I had a row once when they were renovating the Prophet's Mosque in Medina, and the Egyptian architect who did the first restoration did it in what you call stone plaster, which is factice, they call it false, factice in Italian, being false. And I went to the Prince of Medina and I said, you can't do this with imitation stone. And he said, why not? I said, the whole idea of Islamic art is not to imitate nature, but to copy its mode of operation, how it works. So nature works with geometry, so all of Islamic pattern is based on geometry. And thousands of different interlacing patterns. Leonardo da Vinci used to stay 12 hours a day deciphering those patterns and working on them, so much he loved them. So this nature structures, and it structures by geometry, and this was the main calligraphy, geometry, and so on. So in a way, the architecture was very true. There was nothing false. And he said, but what if we don't have money to do it in marble or stone? I said, do it in earth, in mud brick. Poverty is not a shame in the religion. Material poverty is not a shame. It's spiritual poverty that is a shame. So, you know, why be false? So it was always this lamp of truth that Ruskin spoke about, which yes.
What Ruskin makes one also think about the Industrial Revolution and its relationship to architecture in the 19th century. What role would you say contemporary technology should have in the creation of traditional buildings?
Ruskin, I've gathered all his books and tried to read them all. Mostly I did all of them, and I was fascinated by his vision. He said one day you're going to have road upon road, which is all those flyovers we have like in Los Angeles. And he said you keep building, you know, the city one on top of the other like that, and you'll have your skies polluted, and the skies will be dark, and it's exactly what's happening today with talking of carbon emission. And he said, always try to use a natural means before you go to a mechanical. You can use the mechanical, but always use that. Like a man who has a sailboat. He has an auxiliary engine to harbor, but use most of the time the sails. So Ruskin was in that way. If you have an arch, don't use a steel lintel. Make a flat arch and use, you know, always minimize your energy. And he was one of the first environmentalists. The other one is his poetry of architecture, when people brag today about the regionalism. So, poetry of architecture is one of the most beautiful books about describing the character of a nation and the house of a nation. So he speaks of the English house, the French house, the Swiss chalet, the Italian house, and how the climate and the character of the people influence the architecture.
But today, as globalization creates pressure for the homogeneity of culture, this is a more difficult thing to achieve, or it does not, it no longer exists naturally as it once did. Is it our obligation then to try to resist those forces that bring us toward the monoculture?
Yeah, the national character remained in the countryside. That's where you saw the true national character and the innocence and purity. I think the architecture I was involved in, I found it to be of universal character. What is annoying today is how to explain to people that it is not a style. And I think Fletcher did it best, but people got angry when in his book of history of architecture.
Bannister Fletcher.
Yeah, he wrote the architecture, the non-historical styles, and he put them aside. And that was the Oriental architecture from Islam up to Japan, Indochina, Buddhism. And there was a whole treasure house of architecture that was put aside, and we started it by drawing the columns, Corinthian, Ionic, Doric. And history began from Greece. But the Pharaonic we knew nothing about, which is magical. In fact, Pythagoras took all his knowledge from the Egyptian temple. So there is all that knowledge that was lost to us in the curriculum. But I found that Islamic architecture is very universal. I found also something else when I was looking at how the arches developed. In India, I found the embryo of the arch, which was, they used to corbel it. They didn't discover the voussoirs. Then the Romans discovered this circular one, fantastic. You can make the voussoirs. But it stopped there, and they had a problem. Then all of a sudden, the Islamic architecture discovered the two-centered arch, and the Gothic took it. And it changed the whole architecture of the Romanesque into the Gothic, and they managed to play with the vaults by having those two-centered pointed arches. They solved the roof problem, which was the basic problem, and they opened the walls and had all this fantastic light coming through the colored glass, right. And they created a new architectural experience.
I think we could not ask for a better set of thoughts to conclude on. Thank you very much. I know we could go on and on, but I think we want to give you your award. Thank you.
The Henry Hope Reed Award came about a few years after we began giving the Richard H. Driehaus Prize. And it became quickly apparent that we needed to honor those who were not architects, but who had made significant contributions to preservation, to architecture, to classical art in general. Fabio Gramentieri received the Henry Hope Reed Award for his efforts in preservation in Buenos Aires and in the rest of Argentina. Fabio is a practicing preservation architect. He has restored many of the most important monuments in Buenos Aires. He is a champion of preservation overall, writing in the newspapers on a regular basis. He is the author of many books on preservation and the patrimony of Argentina. And he's a dedicated activist to try to change the attitudes towards preservation within his country.
At the Richard H. Driehaus Prize and Henry Hope Reed Award ceremony, Fabio took part in a panel discussion on public policy and preservation that highlighted the important nature of this work.
This morning we thought we would talk a bit about how common interests brought Russell and Fabio together, because they are great friends, and how their individual and collective efforts are a microcosm of the story of preservation and what each of our countries faces today in terms of preservation challenges. It has certainly become an important issue around the world, historic preservation, and in many places you could even say that it's a household word. In this more receptive climate for preservation, Russell and Fabio will be trying to cover what it is you think we need to do a better job of preservation, what you think we need in terms of legislation, professionalism, political will, finances, and the raising of awareness about preservation and its true dimensions, and how people can participate in preservation.
Thank you, Adele. In 1992, I was at the International Council of Monuments and Sites, and we had developed a very constructive relationship with the United States Information Agency, an arm of the United States government generally not known well within the United States because it operates primarily abroad. They operated, and still do, an international visitors program. And US ICOMOS had been encouraged to submit a proposal, and because I was an architect and a preservationist, I submitted a proposal that would bring 9 architects and planners from Central, South America, and the Caribbean to the United States for 2 weeks to expose them and introduce them to how we practiced historic preservation in the United States. And so we began in New Orleans, and for 2 weeks took them on a grand tour through Savannah, Beaufort, Mobile, Thomasville, Georgia, and ended up in Charleston, South Carolina, of course, which has one of the oldest ordinances in America. And that's where I first met Fabio. What's significant about it is that Fabio, I think, was the youngest of the group.
I think so.
Yes. And went back to Argentina, and I think we'll talk about this a little more, but the impressive thing was how he followed up on what he had learned in the United States. And so our relationship continued to grow out of that, and I think we'll cover some of that a bit more.
Wonderful. And Fabio, what accounts for your interest in classicism? Your father was a surgeon.
Yes, let me add that when I arrived here, I was greeted by Russell, and I learned a lot about historic preservation.
So did we all.
I was focused on experiences, European experiences.
Mm-hmm.
I knew very little about history preservation in the United States, and Russell opened my eyes with this great tool, really knowing people from the National Trust, different officials, how the private and public sector works. So back to your question, yes, my father is a physician. He's a surgeon. We're here in the House of Surgeons. I'm very comfortable. Also, I'm very comfortable, but as you see, this is the period of many of the buildings I have been working on.
Yes.
In Buenos Aires, this revival of classicism, French classicism of the early 20th century. But when I was a child, when I was trying to figure out what I'm going to be when growing up, I was between architecture, medicine because of my father, architecture because of my mother. She liked very much architecture and decoration. And I was very fond of also diplomacy and international relations. And I believe that finally I mixed up all three. And well, as an architect, as a doctor, I'm very involved in being a doctor of classic buildings and traditional buildings and historic monuments. Is something that I like it very much.
It's a wonderful image that a preservationist would be more of a doctor administering a cure to a building than a circus performer, where it would be changed into something else very, very different. It's a wonderful way of thinking
and
about
I
it.
always say that, you know, as in medicine, there are treatments and general strategies, but each building is a patient, so you have to be very careful.
Should we go back to what that led to and what the preservation models were, Russell, that you were particularly trying to impart to this group from South America, and how Fabio perhaps picked some of those out to work with right away?
Right. I had been fortunate, as you say, to be present at the birth of the National Register and was part of the task force that implemented all that legislation. And then I went to work for the Trust, so I traveled all over the United States advising preservation groups and organizations. So I had this network of contacts and professionals in all the places we went to see. But the main objectives were to show this group that the federal government played a key role in historic preservation. We had nearly 2 decades more of the National Historic Preservation Act. We had a vibrant National Register of Historic Places. The Act added the concept of historic districts to what we were recognizing and protecting. So there was an enormous growth in the number of urban historic districts that were being created. And the mechanisms by which the city government and the political structure in the city created these entities to administer these districts was a key part of introducing them to that system, as well as we tried to balance it with showing them what the private sector was doing. Because in every successful urban preservation program in America, it usually was started not by the city government, by the private sector. So that was the main objective, and I think we accomplished that. Fabio left, went back to Argentina, and within a short period of time, and I can't remember if this was before the days of email or the fax machine, but
Fax machine.
fax machine days, yes. I received an urgent request from him announcing that the United States State Department was considering disposing of the American ambassador's residence in Buenos Aires. And I knew from what he had, by the way, we'd
So
asked.
this is a building we were responsible for.
We owned it.
Americans. Yeah.
The government didn't
Since
buy it.
since 1929.
So of long standing.
Long-standing. And interestingly enough, the U.S. government didn't buy it. It was bought by the then ambassador and given to the United States government. But it's located on a choice urban corner in downtown Buenos Aires. In any event, he took it on as a preservation challenge and asked me, could you help me? Well, I tried.
This is Fabio calling.
Fabio calling me.
Blowing the whistle on our country.
Blowing the whistle, and not to get too bureaucratic, but there's something in the Preservation Act called Section 106, which mandates that the head of any federal agency that's going to undertake any action affecting a historic property, even though it might be not on the National Register but qualified for the National Register, had to take that into consideration. So that didn't come up much on our tour in America, but I told Fabio, try Section 106. And so he went to work and successfully took on the U.S. State Department, helped save the building, and ended up becoming a preservation consultant on its restoration, which I found rather ironic. But bringing it into a contemporary context, we're about to experience the deaccessioning of a whole host of significant modern U.S. embassies that were commissioned during the Kennedy administration. We had a conscious public policy of retaining prominent architects to design our embassies abroad. So the embassy in Oslo, Norway, for example, designed by Earl Saarinen, is about to be left for a new site, secure site outside the city, prominently located right near the palace in Oslo. The American Embassy in London, they've just announced a new competition for a brand new embassy, and we will be giving up that embassy, also designed by Saarinen. So public policy in the State Department is facing a number of critical issues with regard to design of our embassies abroad.
To turn to the subject of classicism just for a moment, it is true of Argentina as it is of the United States that whenever there was a surge of growth or a burgeoning of the country, classicism was turned to as the style that most embodies the vision of what's going on in the country at that time. And Fabio has already said he was tempted to, he was drawn to the classical architecture of Argentina. And there have been several points along the way since the early 1800s to the 20s to the 1850s and so on, when great buildings have been built in Argentina, including some that were designed and constructed abroad and then disassembled, shipped to Buenos Aires, and then reassembled.
That's true.
That constitute this list of great landmarks in Buenos Aires. Can you talk a little bit about how you developed your relationship with these different periods of the heritage of Buenos Aires?
Let me tell you first that when I was a boy, and every day early in the morning my father drove myself and my brother to the school. At the end of the road, there's a big villa, classical, with the pediments. I was always asleep, but when coming at the end of the road, I woke up. I woke up to see this classical building. And well, for many years. Afterwards, I realized that it was a building by René Sargent, a classical architect of the early 20th century. And by chance, when I was studying architecture, there was a competition for students for monograph on the history of Argentine architecture. I did a monograph and won the prize with a monograph of René Sargent. And some later afterwards, Sargent was back into my life with the Bosch Palace, because he was also the author of the Bosch Palace, which I helped to save together with Russell. I got involved in the restoration project, so that's a little bit. And let me add also that my relation with classicism and the United States was at the very same moment of this visit to the United States in '92. The year before, through this program Russell mentioned, visiting scholar of this program of the State Department, we brought down to Buenos Aires David Van Santen, a real specialist on the history of the Beaux-Arts and classicism. So he showed us in different conferences the classicism here. And that year in '92, after having Russell as a guide in Southeast the United States, I came first to Chicago to meet David, and he showed me up all classicism here in Chicago.
Well, it is wonderful to be in Chicago, which is not only the cradle of modern architecture for the United States, but the ground zero, I mean, there's no other way to put it, of the Columbian Exposition of 1893, which of course gave form and inspiration to the classical movement that swept the United States within just a few years after that event.
And you know, in Buenos Aires, this very strong classical tradition exploded around 1900, with French architects coming down there to Buenos Aires, or exporting projects as René Sergent, and a true school of classicism settled there in Buenos Aires, the School of Architecture of the University of Buenos Aires. And René Sergent was considered one of the masters of private classical architecture, French classical revival. And this was transmitted by the builders of Sergent buildings in Buenos Aires that taught even modernist architects how to learn about composition and scale and different aspects of classicism, not only ornamental issues or decoration, no, but masses, how to play with masses, with spaces, with axes, with proportions, yes.
I'd like to give you the last word, Fabio, and because you're on center stage, having about to win the Henry Hope Reed Award, I have to go back to our visit in October when we visited Teatro Colón, which is one of Fabio's great concerns in the city there. And we witnessed an episode of, I would say, guerrilla warfare, where Fabio was present, and because he's associated with the aggressive preservation of this world-famous building and very, very important local cultural center, which is now suffering from great neglect. It really put a spotlight on the fact that although there are certain laws and although there are certain precedents and although Fabio is there working day and night on the preservation of this great city, he needs a hand. So you're going to get the last word here. What is it that you would like the people in this room to do to help you, if you could command us?
I would ask any of you to help us in Argentina and people in other parts of the world supporting preservation efforts. I do really believe in international cooperation in many fields, but also in historic preservation. My dream is to put together a sort of network under the name of Brick Peace, instead of Greenpeace for bricks.
Brick Peace.
Brick Peace. My email is brickpeace@hotmail.com. So if you want to support the preservation campaign for Teatro Colón, and well, in the future I hope for Beaux-Arts buildings, classical buildings all around the world, well, let's work together.
Now in its 7th year, the Richard H. Driehaus Prize continues to honor major contributors in the field of traditional and classical architecture. The award program was founded through Notre Dame because of its reputation as a national leader in incorporating the ideals of traditional and classical architecture into the task of modern urban development. Abdel-Wahed El-Wakil once was quoted as saying, "To abandon tradition, to disregard the achievements and models of the past, and to be caught up in the trauma of change, means to be incapable of handling the new." The University of Notre Dame School of Architecture, through the Richard H. Driehaus Prize, honors that legacy and carries it forward with ideas and technologies that preserve the greater good of cities, large and small.